let's take a look at these and just go through them. So let's say that we have a 0 note away perfect first. So we're on a 0 note away perfect first. What's the inverse of a 0 note away perfect first? Well, it's obviously the same, because the perfect first means that we didn't go anywhere. That basically means we went 0 steps forward. And by the way, most people don't say 0, but I'm going to say the note distance all the time, because that's the most important thing about the measurement tool. So we didn't go anywhere. The perfect doesn't mean anything, right, either. Doesn't really help you out at all, because it doesn't tell you where the starting point is. So if you have the distance, the perfect doesn't really matter. But then you've got the first, which you know is off by 1. That's the distance we traveled from whatever note we happen to be measuring from, right? And we didn't travel anywhere because it's off by 1. It should be 0, right? It should be a 0 note away perfect 0, right? Okay, so then we're going to say that let's do this one. Let me undo that. Hold on a sec. So now we have a 1 note away, a distance of 1 note. We generally think clockwise, right? So we'd have a 1 note away minor second. So that would be something like if I was on the sea, that would land me in the ocean, right? But if I was on like the Phrygian, then I can go 1 step up. That distance, I can call that a 1 note away minor second. So what would be the inverse? What if I'm going then from this back to here? Well, then we would call that, then you would think, a negative 1 note away, right? But that's not normally what we do. We usually think as though we're going to continue going clockwise, 12 minus 1, which would be 11. And so even though I'm going back from here back to here, I'm going to call that then an 11 note away, which we then just have to know is a major 7. So we're going to add directionality when we get over here. Now, if I look at our modal distance term, what would we use it from a modal distance term? Well, let's look at one where we're going to be on the continents. If I was an Ionian to Ionian, that would land me in the ocean, right? I could think of the inverse as though I'm going from the ocean, which would be the I plus, right, in the ocean, to the I, but we don't typically do that, right? We're usually going to be using, this interval if I was on like the Phrygian over here, right? So if I was on the Phrygian, I would call that that it's a PY, right? We would be going from the Phrygian to the Lydian. So you could call that from a modal range, a PY modal range, or a 3-4 modal range. What's the distance between those two? It would be a 1 note away from the Phrygian, which is the first modal half step, which would be the second scale degree, right? And then so what would be the opposite of that? Well, you could say from a modal range system, it would be going from Y to P, right? So I could find the opposite going, okay, that's going to be, let me put another one of these here. Actually, let me use my pen. I'm going to try to get fancy with my pen. I can't see where my cursor went. Here, I'll use the highlighter. So it would be a YP, right? It would be a YP right here. So that's going to be a YP modal range, because now I'm going from the Y back to the P. But remember, if I'm on a YP modal range, I could go forward 11. So that's going to be an 11 note away Y 6 modal half step, which would be the 7th scale degree, right? Similar to the 11 note away major 7. But I can also think of it as I'm going back 1, which would make, because I could be going from the 4 backwards to the 3. 4 back to the 3, which would be a negative 1. So we'll talk about that terminology actually makes sense if you think about it this way. I could have negative directionality. We'll get into that in a future presentation, but I just want to introduce that now. All right, let's go to the next one. So if I can switch this back to okay, let's do the next one. So I'm going to bring this down. So now we've got a 2 note away. So it's a 2 note away. We typically call that a major second, which would mean it would be a major first modal half step. So if we go 2 notes away from the sea here, that will land us on a continent. And so what would be the inverse? What if I'm going from this Dorian back to the Ionian? So normally we would call that the inverse, 12 minus 2, which would be 10 notes away, which means I'm not going directionally negative backwards. I would normally think about it as going 10 notes up, and we would say that 10 note up distance is a minor 7. But I would also start to think, and we'll introduce this later again, that the minor 7 could also be thought of 10 notes forward, but also 2 notes backwards. That's how you can add directionality kind of in your mind with these same terms. Now, a little trick to realize here is that when you're looking at the inverse of a minor will be a major. The inverse of a major will typically be a minor pretty much all the time. And the inverse of a perfect will always be a perfect. There's kind of reasons for that. That's a little kind of, again, like a hack type of thing that might help you to understand those or memorize what the inverse is going to be. But what you really want to do is look at the distances and be able to figure out what the distance is and then know the name for those distances. Now that 2 note away is in the Ionian. So if I look at it from the perspective of an Ionian node, we also know that the 2 note, I could go 2 notes up, right, from an Ionian node and land on a continent. I could go 2 notes up from the Lydian node and land on a continent, from the Mixolydian node and land on the continent. So most of the time, because that's a whole step, we can go 2 steps up and still land on a continent is the general idea. So let's just look at it from the Ionian node. We can call that an ID modal range. That would be a 2-1 modal range. What's the distance? It would be a 2 note away from the Ionian node first modal half step, which would be the second scale degree, right? A 2 note away first modal half step, which would be the second scale degree. The M isn't really important. The 2 is the thing that's important. All right, well, what if I was to reverse that? Then I would be going from I to D. Now I want to go from D back to I. So D to I would be, if I go over here, here's a D to I. So we're going to call that a DI modal range, a 2-1 modal range. What's the distance? Well, we typically think about it going clockwise from this D forward, which would be a 10 note away from the Dorian mode, 6th modal half step, which would be the 7th scale degree. But I could think about it as going backwards from this D negative 2. So again, we'll talk about that. That directionality actually works this way. I could use this same modal range and say, hey, look, I can get there by going clockwise or counterclockwise. And it actually works with this term where it doesn't really work with the other. So we'll talk about that later. So let's go ahead and do the next one. I'm going to see if I can get back here and then here. All right. So now we're going to go to a 3 note away minor third. So if I have a minor third, notice I can't go 3 notes away from the Ionian. That lands me in the ocean. That's why it's a minor. Let's pick a minor node. If I'm on the Aeolian and I go 3 notes away, that lands me on a continent. So okay, what would be the inverse if I went 3 notes away? Now notice it says it's a minor third. If I say I'm going from the Aeolian, that makes me think that that has to be the first, but it doesn't, because the 3 notes away just simply means that it's 2 modal half steps forward. 2 modal half steps forward, or 3 notes away. So I can still keep that as a 6 and count up from there, and that's okay, right? And so I'm going to say, all right, what's the inverse? Well, if I want to go back from the C back to the A, that would be 1, 2, 3, negative 3, but we usually think it's 12 minus 3, which is 9. That would be a 9 note away, which we have to just know is a major 6. Now, so that means that when I go from here to here, I'm thinking about it as though I'm going forward 6. But you can also think that a major 6 also means that I could go back 3, right? A negative 3. So that's what I would introduce in your mind, which we'll talk more about later. But when I'm looking at directionality, I could think about these intervals as either going a clockwise distance or a counterclockwise distance in general. All right, so then we're going to say, all right, is that one is not in the Ionian, right? So we would normally not be measuring that from here. We would often be measuring from something like a minor mode, like let's say a Dorian mode. So from the Dorian mode, we would have a 2-4 modal range, for example. So now I'm on a Dorian here, and I can go 3 notes up to the Lydian, Dorian to the Lydian. That would be a dy modal range here to here. So a 2-4 modal range. What's the distance? It's a 3 note away from the Dorian mode second modal half step, which would be the 3rd scale degree. A 3 note away second modal half step, 3rd scale degree. The M's not really helping me out much I'd rather know the node that I'm measuring from. Okay, well, how would I go the other way? How would I go backwards? Well, it would be a dy. I'd be going from the y back to the d. So the Lydian to the Dorian. So let's find a y d. So it would be over here somewhere. So wait a sec, a y d, right there. Boom, 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 boom. So if I went backwards, it would be a yd modal range, a 4-2 modal range, which again, if I'm on this 4, that would normally mean I go clockwise or to the right 9 steps away from the Lydian mode, which would bring me around in a circle to get back to the Dorian, and that would be a 9 node away from the Lydian 5th modal half step, right? But I could also, which would be the 6th scale degree. But I could also say, well, 7 minus 5 would be 2 modal half steps backwards, 1, 2, right? So or 12 minus 9 would be -3 backwards. So this modal range could also allow us to have a term that has distance, again, going forwards and backwards. We'll talk about the backwards name later. All right, let's go to the next one, and I'll go back up here and say the next one, we've got a 4-note away major third. So a 4-note away major third, that is something that's in the Ionian. So because if I go 4 from the C, 1, 2, 3, 4, it lands me on a continent. So, okay, that's great. What's the inverse? Well, it would be 12 minus 4, which would be 8. So if I'm on this E and I want to go back to the 4, we typically think about it as though I'm going forward around in a circle to the 4, 8 notes forward, which is a minor 6. That means that the minor 6, however, you can also think of it as though you could go 1, 2, 3, 4 steps back. So I would start thinking about a minor 6 as either being 8 steps forwards or 4 steps back. That allows you to, again, to have that directionality so you can count from the bottom strings to the top strings of the guitar. But it would be better if we used a term that had that built in, that would be easier to add directionality, like if we have an IP modal range, Ionian to the Phrygian, and then I want to go the other way, what would we call that? Well, that would be, by the way, this distance would be a 4-note away from the Ionian node, 2nd modal half step, which would be the 3rd scale degree. So if I went the other way, it would be a PI, Phrygian to the Ionian. So let's look over here. We have the Phrygian to the Ionian, which is right there. So if I went backwards, what would that be? Well, it would be a PI modal range, which I could go clockwise, which would be an 8-note away from the Phrygian node 5th modal half step, which would be the 6th scale degree, or I can go backwards. And the reverse of this would be 5 minus 7, because there's 7, so which would be a -2, right? So I could go back a -2